Garmin appears to have included ECG functionality within their recently released Venu 2 Plus smartwatch, albeit without acknowledging its existence or including the feature at launch. This is notable because there's currently no Garmin wearable with ECG functionality on it, well, at least officially anyway. Still, Garmin's shift towards medical devices and specifically ECG functionality wouldn't necessarily be a surprise. Last spring, Garmin quietly began a clinical trial to test ECG-related features, derived from a Garmin wrist-worn, consumer device. The presence of ECG diagnostics hardware and diagnostics app on the Venu 2 Plus, combined with Garmin's clinical trials testing, indicates the company is clearly working towards a goal of launching ECG functionality in their wearables. Of course, the timing of that is still unknown, as well as whether or not the Venu 2 Plus will ever officially gain ECG functionality. When the company launched the Venu 2 Plus this past January, its core new features were a speaker, a microphone, with calling-related functions. Omitted from that list was any mention of ECG functionality, or even future ECG functionality. The fact that we're seeing it now is largely due to a seemingly accidental act that left it in the diagnostic menus on units that were produced prior to February. Garmin has since removed that diagnostic menu in a firmware update, though it's highly doubtful they've removed the actual ECG hardware. At present, Garmin doesn't officially acknowledge its existence in the unit, but does acknowledge the clinical study. Of course, it kinda has to acknowledge that since it's listed under their name on the US government website. But again, we'll circle back to that later in the post. First, look at Garmin's ECG. The ability to see the ECG function is hardly a finished product. To be clear, everything you see in this post is the hardware test diagnostics menu within the watch. This menu is normally reserved for Garmin technicians to troubleshoot various features. It includes diagnostic pages for sensors, accelerometers, NFC functionality, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, displays, etc. Generally speaking, if you're using that menu, something has gone wrong and you're trying to determine whether the hardware is the cause. It's available on every Garmin watch and has been for probably a decade now. However, what's not been there is a new ECG diagnostic page. That was accidentally discovered by a user on the Garmin forums back in early February. However, their experience there was short-lived, without any further documentation or photos. When they went back to access that feature later in the day, it was no longer there. That's because, by that point, the watch had updated its firmware to the most recent version, which meant the option went away. You see, Garmin, like most companies, manufactures hardware well before products start shipping to you. Apple, GoPro, and countless others do the same. It allows them to stockpile hardware while they finalize the software. This is often 2 to 4 months ahead of release. When these units are made, they need some sort of software on them so that when you unbox them for the first time, they'll pair up to your phone and get updated to the current firmware. Ironically, I just posted about this concept a few days ago. Given my existing Venu 2 Plus had long since updated to the most recent production firmware and removed the feature, I did what any normal person would do. I ordered another new Venu 2 Plus off of Amazon, and it arrived the next day. I then opened it up and without pairing to anything, went into the diagnostics menu. It showed the factory-made firmware version of 6.05, so plenty old to still contain the feature. And sure enough, just 2 taps through the menu pages later was the ECG diagnostic menu. Now to reiterate again, this isn't meant to be a pretty display of your ECG. It's a hardware diagnostic test screen, so it's displaying the core data that Garmin needs to troubleshoot to test the ECG hardware itself. Undoubtedly, the normal end-user feature would be prettier and have pretty red ECG lines, warnings, usage instructions, and more. Why red lines? Because obviously, it has to be red. Any other color means it's clearly fake. The way the ECG app works is that you place your opposite thumb and index finger on the bezel, and within about 1 to 2 seconds it'll start reading your ECG, taking a few more seconds to stabilize. The moment you remove your fingers from the bezel, it stops. This is essentially the same as how other companies have implemented it. With some companies, you touch the digital crown instead, but the concept is the same. By using your opposite wrist or hand, you complete the required electrical circuit. Playing around with hand position appears to relatively easily impact accuracy, as does playing around with one finger versus 2 fingers on the bezel. Certainly, this diagnostics software is likely 5 to 7 months old, and was never intended to do anything more than show raw sensor data. Just like all the other service menu pages do, for things like accelerometer, heart rate, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, GPS, and more. Nonetheless, it's clearly producing a valid-looking ECG. And given that Garmin completed a 568-person clinical trial last October, with at least some Garmin-made ECG hardware, it's likely by this point Garmin knows what they are doing here. Here's a look at how that ECG wave pattern looks compared to an Apple Watch Series 7, worn back-to-back. Now normally, most watches that feature ECG functionality also allow you to record the ECG trace, and then export the results to send to a doctor. They also typically monitor or check for certain conditions, like atrial fibrillation, which is an irregular heartbeat pattern. They never check for whether a heart attack is occurring. However, given this is in the diagnostics menu and not the normal feature, we don't get that here. Undoubtedly, that'd be in any normal ECG feature down the road, so we'll have to see on that if and when Garmin makes a feature out of this. And in fact, in Garmin's clinical trials they even outline what features they are trying to complete. So, let's dig into that. The clinical trials study. Last spring Garmin recruited for a US clinical trial. As by law, any clinical trial in the US that's done on people must be registered and listed publicly on the clinicaltrials.government database or website. That government organization isn't quite the FDA, but has loose ties to it. It's those clinical trials that are then used as the basis for submission to regulatory agencies like the FDA, or other medical regulatory bodies around the world. Garmin's submission is here. In Garmin's case, they began the study last March 31, 2021, and then concluded the response period on October 4, 2021. That means that during that time frame, they were actively gathering data from real-world humans. Then last month, they filed an update to the study indicating they did indeed conclude data collection last fall, as well as the final number of participants. In Garmin's case, they had initially filed the trials to include 460 participants, however, by the end, they had included 568 participants. In talking to various industry folks, that's pretty normal, as participants that were initially included are occasionally removed from the study later on. That can be because the individual might not have met the criteria upon further inspection, or perhaps there were protocol errors in their sample. You'd expect to see some increase between the projected number and the final number. The study's purpose was, in their own words, to confirm the Garmin ECG software algorithm can detect and classify atrial fibrillation and normal sinus rhythm on single-lead ECG data derived from a Garmin wrist-worn consumer device. The study will also confirm the software's ability to create a lead-eye ECG that is clinically equivalent to a reference device. The Garmin ECG software is not a diagnostic system and is intended for informational purposes only. In other words, they wanted to A. Validate the accuracy of the ECG data itself. B. Validate the accuracy of their software identifying atrial fibrillation and a normal sinus rhythm. Basically, they were aiming to have the same baseline validation and features that Apple, Samsung, and others do. In order to do this, as the study outlines, they recruited through their partner research and medical organizations 2 different groups of people. Those with known AFib, and those with a normal sinus rhythm. And they did this across 6 different sites in the US. It's this two-group recruitment